let's see if there's, yeah, this is, we can basically very quickly look at the slide deck and then look at A2. So you're going to be compiling the Linux kernel. You start off by getting the kernel tree, and you just, you do a git clone, and that gets you the kernel tree. If you don't have much space in your VM or on your machine, you probably want to use the --depth equals 1. And so that just looks like this. Yeah, it's nice. You can just copy from these slides. Git clone, and right over here, depth equals.
You will need to eventually unshallow it because of the we're going to want to look in the history, but you can to start with, you can undo it shallow.
Yeah, if you wanted to get it done quickly, but I mean, you might as well get it out of the way and just not do it with depth equals 1, because you will need the whole history. The thing is, you could clone the kernel if you really are constrained for space. You can clone the full history of the kernel onto a different machine that you're not actually going to be using for compiling and running, just to look through it and to find hashes and to find information, and then do the actual work on the shallow tree to save space in your VM or something. But it will be
you can also clone with depth equals 1, right? And you only need that for like A2 and A3, and then I forget which one. I think it's A4. For A4, we'll put a reminder that if you did depth equals 1, you can use there's a way to pull like unshallow. So I mean, you can do depth equals 1, or if you're willing to wait a little bit longer, you can not do it at depth equals 1 and just get it over with and download everything. Because I guess if you did depth 1, you only need the space, but then there's going to be a bunch of build artifacts. You can clean it. You could run make clean, and then you could do unshallow, and hopefully it would end up not taking up too much space. But there's a question in chat. Vlad has a question about A2. Just to make sure, when we submit, do we put the output of uname, dmessage, and who am I into the newly renamed?
Yes.
Yeah.
We'll go over that. Right after this slide deck. But yeah, no, you have it correct. Basically, just like a little worksheet, to just very briefly write up your experience compiling the kernel. So you get the source code, and you need the tools to compile the kernel. We have a list of them here, mostly, pretty much. If you have Fedora, you can literally just sudo dnf build depth kernel, and it's roughly the same thing as installing these packages, which roughly translate into something very similar on other distros. But obviously, you can just look in, I think, in documentation/changes in that file. Linux. Let's see. This should, like kernel.org documentation, minimum things required to compile the kernel. Yeah, it's right here. So, I can even put that, just leave that open. Sorry, Fedora, we have that over on A2. Distributions might be slightly different. Kernel is very configurable, but you don't really need to mess with that right now. Just get the existing config from your system, and you just copy it boot/config/ then $uname-r. It'll basically be, I mean, on most systems, at least on Fedora, it'll be in there by this name. On Arch, it's different. Like if you're on Arch, look it up. You know how to do that if you're running Arch. Congratulations for running Arch. Now generate a new config based on those options. You basically just run old def config on that file. And briefly, just what that looks like, is this is my Linux directory. I've got stuff in here, so I would just like copy, boot config. So first of all, my uname-r looks like that. So I do boot cp /boot config 418.372. But I can just uname-r star. And there we go. Right, and now to.config like that. Right. Now my .config is all this stuff. Right. It's specific for Red Hat. I'm running OS release. I'm running Red Hat Enterprise Linux 8.6, in fact. Yeah, there's a Red Hat release folder actually. So you can see here, Red Hat release, Red Hat Enterprise Linux release 8.6. And then just, make old def config. And we'll just, prepare, and we'll like overwrite old values. So, all right. So you don't even need to, the important thing is that it's renamed to, .config. So it'll find it. And then you just run with the -J will multi-thread the compilation, and with the number of processes that you have, and proc will just print the number of cores on your machine. It may crash, and there may be things you need to fix, discuss in the Discord or look it up. Ideally, Google it first, and then if you can't figure it out, ask in the Discord. Say like, "Oh, I looked up this answer, and I'm confused about this thing." That'll be that'll get more attention. So you'll run into issues like missing dependencies. Just figure it out. That's the assignment. When you finished, you've compiled it, but what's the point if you aren't using it? So then you run, once you have, you're going to have the modules, and the VM Linux is the actual binary, It's basically just a regular binary, and you can expect this binary and do things with it. And let's get upgrade to RHEL 8.7. And then, so when you have it, you want to install your modules and install a kernel. So that's what this does. You want to use sudo because you're actually putting things into directories that, need root permissions to access generally. And so that will install your modules and install the VM Linux file in a compressed format. So it'll look like, VM Linux, let's see, file, boot VM Linux, 418, 32. Just look at one of them, right? And we see here's a Linux kernel x86 bootable BZ image. So it's a bzipped image, right? It's a compressed image of the kernel, and tells me where it was compiled and other information. And file is just a command to look at information about a file. So, and that comes from the VM Linux file that you compiled earlier. And then you've built and installed the kernel. All right. And then you just need to reboot into the kernel. And so you can use, I don't know if this is exactly mentioned here. I think we mentioned this. There's some resources here. The Fedora has a guide on this. They also have a guide on building your own kernel, and Bootlin is a good place to browse the kernel source. We also recommend getting Ccache, and that will speed up subsequent kernel builds by caching the objects.
You should make sure that you have that. And we didn't put it in those slides because the slides are a little bit less out of date, but you should follow this first. And then if this isn't good, look at because this doesn't have the information at the extra version. That slide deck is honestly pretty out of date. You should read this first. You can look at the slide deck as a second thing, but this is the real source of truth, is this page.
Yeah, I was hoping there was actually a little more in the slide deck. I mean, at least we have these resources, which are, that could be interesting. Look at the Fedora resources. It's definitely more polished than this web page. But this is nice and short. It'll show you how to do it. It has roughly the same thing. Add something cool to the extra version variable to change. That'll change what you see in in your uname-a, right? You can have some text right in this string.
Do you want to show them where that is in the makefile?
Yes. If you look at our kernel makefile, first of all, it's huge, 1,000 lines. All it does and it does it recursively. I don't know, for some reason, the name of the latest version 6 is Herder. I'm a Ninja Sloth. I didn't, I think that comes from Linus Torvalds. Anyways, extra version, you do it right here. So you can add dot, Joel kernel or something, right? And then when we do uname-a, we'll see this string. And you also see this in the grub menu. Another thing I want to mention that I don't think we put on there is to set a kernel as the default, right? On Fedora and RHEL, those types of distributions, you can use the grubby command. And of course, and grubby, always useful if you want to see more information. The two ones that are interesting for us, I mean, there's interesting things like, adding different kernels and adding arguments to the kernel and removing arguments. Very useful tool. The important ones for us are default kernel to check which kernel is the default, and set default. So we can just do grubby, default.
But you should probably not set it as default, just in case. You should probably
I'm just
boot
showing
into it.
what the output is. I'm not actually going to set my kernel as the Yeah.
But
I
to
mean,
people watching this and listening right now, like you might, something might be wrong with your compiled kernel, and if you set it as default, you're going to boot into that, which might be problematic. So I would,
yeah, I
you
mean,
can-
generally, yeah, it depends on how your VM is configured. Like if you can see the grub menu. If you can't see the grub menu, you probably want to. I mean, I don't know. I usually personally set it as the default, which maybe is like a little risky, but I don't know if there's a way to set the like the next boot, like a temporary default. Man, grubby. I'm not entirely sure, but you'll need to make sure that it boots into the next kernel. So that little page that comes up, which says like select a kernel or selected OS when you start, that's where you select the kernel. So yeah, you can use this tool to deal with it. And if you do want to set the default, here's how you do it. You do -- set default, then boot, via Linux, and then whatever you choose a kernel. And then you probably want to unset it after you're done with it, unless you want to use it. But yes, important warning from Dennis. Basically, you follow these instructions, and then you get the kernel, and you do these commands. You put them in the worksheet. You submit that. Much more straightforward, I think, than the other one, but in some ways more annoying due to having to wait and do this whole process because it might be a little unfamiliar if you haven't done it before.